You ever feel like you've made the biggest mistake of your life, but it's too late to back out? That's exactly how I felt the moment we moved into the house on Ashwood Drive. I didn't say anything at first because, well, my wife was over the moon about it. And honestly, it looked perfect. 3 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a fireplace, and a backyard big enough to host half the neighborhood. The price? Dirt cheap, almost laughably low. I remember joking with the realtor. "What's the catch?" She laughed too, but there was something off about the way she avoided eye contact. "Oh, nothing, just some maintenance issues," she had said. "We should have turned around then." The first night was when I noticed something wasn't right. We were lying in bed, exhausted from unpacking, when I heard what sounded like whispering. I sat up, holding my breath, but it stopped. My wife was already asleep, so I brushed it off as wind outside or the old pipes groaning. But deep down, I knew it wasn't either of those. The second night, it got worse. Around midnight, I woke up to this thumping sound. Slow, deliberate, like someone walking up the stairs. I froze, listening as the steps got closer. When I finally worked up the courage to look, there was no one there, just the dark hallway stretching into the shadows. That's when the dreams started. I kept dreaming of the house, but not as it was now. In the dreams, it was darker, rotting, and filled with this choking sense of dread. I'd walk through the halls and hear voices, low, murmuring voices, coming from the walls. I'd try to run, but the floorboards would twist and grab at my feet like hands, pulling me down. One night I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, and I swear I heard someone whisper, "Welcome home." Things escalated quickly after that. Doors would open on their own. Lights flickered constantly, even though the wiring had been inspected before we moved in. Objects moved. I'd leave my phone on the kitchen counter, only to find it in the living room. My wife started noticing it too. She'd go pale whenever the bathroom door creaked open by itself or the TV turned on in the middle of the night. But the worst part? The basement. I hated that basement from the moment I saw it. The air down there was damp and heavy, and the walls were covered in scratches. Not little nicks, but deep, jagged gouges like someone or something had been clawing at them. One night, after hearing a loud crash from down there, I decided to check it out. The light bulb had burned out, so I had to use my phone flashlight. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something carved into the concrete floor. A series of strange symbols I didn't recognize. And then I heard it. Breathing, not my own. This was heavier, raspier, coming from the far corner of the basement. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there, just shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I bolted upstairs and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. When I told my wife about it, she just stared at me, her face pale. "I've been hearing it too," she whispered. After that, we tried to avoid the basement altogether, but the house, it wouldn't let us. The noises got louder, footsteps, whispers, banging on the walls. My wife started waking up with scratches on her arms, and I'd wake up feeling like someone was sitting on my chest, watching me. One night, we decided enough was enough. We packed our bags and planned to leave the next morning. But the house had other plans. That night, I woke up to the sound of the front door slamming. I ran downstairs thinking someone had broken in, but the door was locked. When I turned around, the kitchen chairs were all stacked in a perfect pyramid on the table. Then I heard my wife scream from upstairs. I sprinted to our bedroom and found her standing in the corner, staring at the closet. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "It's in there," she whispered. The closet door was ajar, just enough for me to see darkness inside. Slowly, I reached out and pulled it open. There was nothing inside, just empty shelves and a faint smell of damp earth. But as I turned to tell her, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. I felt something cold brush against my arm, And then the whispering started again, low and guttural, right next to my ear. When the door finally opened, my wife was gone. I searched the entire house, screaming her name, but there was no sign of her. The police searched too, but they didn't find anything either. I moved out the next day. It's been 6 months, and I still don't know what happened to her. Sometimes late at night I'll hear faint whispers coming from the box of things I kept from the house. And every now and then I dream of her, standing in the basement, her face pale, her eyes hollow, whispering the same 2 words over and over. Come back. I haven't gone back to the house on Ashwood Drive, not physically at least, but in my dreams I'm there almost every night. And every time, it's the same. The rotting walls, the stench of damp earth, and my wife standing in the basement, staring at me with those hollow, lifeless eyes. At first, I told myself it was just guilt eating away at me. I'd abandoned her, hadn't I? I'd run when I should have stayed to fight, to figure out what was happening. But deep down, I know it's more than guilt. The house is calling me back. I've tried to move on, but strange things keep happening. My phone rings in the middle of the night, but when I answer, there's no one there, just static and sometimes faint whispers. Once, I thought I heard my wife's voice through the static, calling my name. Then there are the scratches. They started appearing on my walls about a month ago. At first, I thought it was just wear and tear, but they're too deliberate. Long, jagged lines, just like the ones in the basement. The worst was last week. I came home from work to find the words "Come Back" scrawled on my bathroom mirror in what looked like condensation. Except the room was bone dry. I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending it's all in my head. I know the house wants me back, and if I want answers, if I want to find my wife, I have to go. I drove to Ashwood Drive last night. The house looked the same as it did the day I left, but it felt different. The air around it was thick, heavy, like the house was alive and breathing. The front door was unlocked, of course. It swung open the moment I touched it, creaking loudly, as if the house was welcoming me back. Inside, everything was just as I remembered, the same creaky floors, the same peeling wallpaper. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before, a smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, rotting wood and earth, like the smell of an open grave. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew they wouldn't work. Instead, I pulled out my flashlight and made my way to the basement. The door was already open, and the stairs seemed steeper than I remembered. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I reached the bottom, I could see my breath in the dim light. The symbols were still there, carved into the concrete floor, but now they glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then I saw her. My wife was standing in the corner, just as she had been in my dreams. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they weren't her eyes. They were black, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small space. I didn't know what to do," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. She took a step toward me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of the woman I'd married, the warmth in her smile, the light in her eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by something dark, something wrong. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice shifting, becoming deeper, almost guttural. "It won't let you leave again." Before I could respond, the room began to shake. The walls groaned, and the symbols on the floor glowed brighter, casting the basement in an eerie red light. The whispers I'd heard in my dreams grew louder, rising to a deafening chorus. And then I saw them. Figures began to emerge from the walls, their bodies twisted and shadowy, their eyes glowing faintly in the red light. They moved toward me slowly, their whispers turning into a single chilling chant. "Stay with us. Stay with us. Stay with us. I turned to run, but the stairs were gone, swallowed up by the shifting shadows. My wife, or whatever she had become, was now inches from me, her black eyes boring into mine. You can't leave, she said, a cruel smile spreading across her lips. You belong to the house now. I don't know what happened after that. I woke up this morning in my car parked outside the house with no memory of how I got there. The scratches on my arms are deeper now, and my clothes are covered in dirt and dust. But the worst part? When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw her sitting in the back seat, smiling at me with those hollow black eyes. The house may have let me go, but I know it's not over. Wherever I go, it will follow, and one day it will take me back for good. I stared at the rearview mirror, frozen. She was there, sitting in the back seat, her pale skin almost glowing in the dim light, but as I blinked, she was gone, just like that. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Maybe the stress, the fear, it was all getting to me. But when I turned around, the back seat wasn't empty. There was something there. A small wooden box. It hadn't been there before. My hands were trembling as I reached for it, the rough wood cold to the touch. It looked old, ancient even, with strange carvings etched into its surface. They reminded me of the symbols in the basement, the ones that glowed and pulsed like veins in the house's heart. I hesitated, but something compelled me to open it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of the house, but not the house as it is now. This was different. The paint was fresh, the yard pristine, and there were people standing on the porch. A man, a woman, and a little girl holding hands. They looked happy, normal, but then my stomach dropped. The man in the photo was me, and the woman wasn't my wife. I stared at the picture, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't possible. I didn't have a daughter, and I didn't recognize the woman at all. I turned the photograph over and scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "You've always been here." A chill ran down my spine. Number, this couldn't be real. I threw the box into the passenger seat and started the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. But as I pulled onto the road, something felt wrong. The houses around me were unfamiliar. The street lights were dimmer, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to move, and the road stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't in my neighborhood anymore. I wasn't anywhere I recognized. The trees lining the road were gnarled and black, their branches reaching out like claws. The further I drove, the darker it got, until the headlights barely pierced the suffocating blackness. And then I saw it, the house. It was right in front of me, its windows glowing faintly, like eyes watching me. The same house on Ashwood Drive, the same house I had just left. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I had driven miles away. I was sure of it. But there it was, standing in the same spot, as if waiting for me. I didn't want to go back inside, but something was pulling me toward it, an invisible force that I couldn't resist. My legs moved on their own as I got out of the car and walked up the steps. The door creaked open before I could touch it, and the whispers started again, louder this time. The house wasn't done with me. When I stepped inside, the air was different, heavy, suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing brighter than before. And then I heard laughter. It was coming from the living room, a child's laughter. I followed the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. Sitting on the couch was the little girl from the photograph, her dark curls bouncing as she giggled and played with a doll. "Daddy!" she said, looking up at me with wide, innocent eyes. My blood ran cold. Behind her, the woman from the photo appeared, smiling warmly. "Welcome home," she said. her voice sweet, familiar, yet completely wrong. I stumbled back, shaking my head. Number no, this isn't real. But it is, the woman said, her smile twisting into something cruel. You've always been here. You just forgot. The house, it helps you remember. The walls began to close in, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. I turned to run, but the door was gone. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the little girl's face. Her innocent smile twisted into something monstrous, her eyes black and hollow. They found my car a week later, abandoned on the side of the road. There was no sign of me, but the box was still in the passenger seat. Inside it was the photograph. Except now the little girl wasn't holding hands with a stranger. She was holding hands with me, and beneath it, written in fresh, shaky handwriting, were the words, "I'm home." I still don't know why we moved into that house. I mean, sure, it was cheap, and on paper it was perfect, spacious, with a huge backyard, and in a nice quiet neighborhood. The kind of place you'd imagine raising kids, planting a garden, maybe getting a dog. But now, I can't even drive by it without feeling like something's watching me. Let me start at the beginning. I was so excited when we first moved in. My girlfriend Emma and I were just starting our life together. We found this house, an old Victorian-style place that had been on the market for months. The neighbors didn't seem too friendly, but I shrugged it off. I didn't care. It was our house. We weren't rich, but we were managing, and this was the kind of dream home you picture when you finally get your own place. We got the keys on a Friday. The sun was shining, and I could already picture us sitting on the porch, enjoying the breeze, drinking coffee in the morning. But the moment we stepped inside, I felt wrong. Something about the air was heavy. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It didn't help that the house was huge and kind of empty. The creaky wooden floors, the dim lighting, the high ceilings that seemed to swallow any sound. It all gave me this weird, eerie vibe. Emma was excited, though. She ran upstairs to pick a bedroom, practically skipping. I stood there for a second longer, just looking around. I couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me. It wasn't like a haunted house kind of feeling, you know? It was more like the house knew something I didn't. "Babe, come check this out." Emma's voice echoed down from upstairs. I snapped out of it and headed up after her. The upstairs was even more unnerving than the first floor. The narrow hallways felt cramped, and there was this old, musty smell, like someone hadn't lived there in ages, but I forced myself to smile. "Coming!" She had picked a bedroom at the front of the house, the one with the big bay window. It looked out onto the street below, with a perfect view of the neighbors' houses. She seemed thrilled with it, immediately calling dibs on the entire space. "We can turn this into the master bedroom," she said, grinning. I was glad she liked it. Still, that uneasy feeling lingered, like there was something hiding in the walls, or maybe just under the floorboards. I couldn't explain it, but every time I walked through the house, I felt this sense of displacement, like I wasn't supposed to be there. By the time we finished unpacking, it was late, and we were both exhausted. We had pizza for dinner, and watched a movie in the living room. I remember being so relieved to just be done with the chaos of moving. But as we got ready to go to bed, I heard something. It was a noise, soft but distinct, like scratching, but it wasn't coming from anywhere obvious. I looked at Emma, and I could tell she heard it too. She didn't say anything, but she shifted uncomfortably on the couch. I didn't think much of it at first. The house was old after all. Old houses creak and groan. But when we went to bed, the scratching continued. It sounded like it was coming from the walls, just beneath the surface. Every few seconds, there it was. Scritch, scratch, scratch. "Do you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, my heart suddenly racing. It's probably just the house settling, I tried to reassure her, but even I wasn't sure I believed that. The scratching didn't stop. I lay there in the dark, trying to ignore it, but it only grew louder. It was like something or someone was trying to get out. Maybe we should check the walls, Emma said, but her voice was shaky now, and I could feel her fear creeping into my own chest. I'll check in the morning, I muttered, hoping it would just stop, but it didn't. It went on all night, and by morning I was completely drained. Emma looked just as tired as I felt. Maybe it's rats or something, I said, trying to sound casual, but even I wasn't buying it. Rats don't scratch like that. And besides, we hadn't seen any signs of pests. The next day, we spent the afternoon going through boxes, trying to make the place feel more like home. I kept hearing things, faint whispers, footsteps when no one was around, but every time I'd ask Emma if she heard it, she'd brush it off. Maybe I was just tired, I told myself. I was already overthinking things. But that night, the scratching started again. Only this time it was worse. It wasn't just the walls. It was the ceiling, the floor, and, worst of all, the door. I woke up in the middle of the night to find the door to our bedroom wide open. I was certain I had closed it before going to bed. The house was deathly silent, but the air felt thick, like something was about to happen. I didn't want to move, but I had to get up to shut the door. As I stepped out into the hallway, I noticed the light in the bathroom was on. I know I turned it off before bed. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. I turned toward the bathroom and took a few cautious steps. As I got closer, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I pushed open the door, the room was empty, but the mirror was fogged up like someone had just breathed on it, and in the fog, written in condensation, was a single word: leave. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I wiped away the fog, thinking maybe I was imagining things, but there it was, as clear as day. Leave! I couldn't even breathe for a moment. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone. I stood in the bathroom, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I glanced over my shoulder, but the hallway was empty. No one there, but I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I slowly backed away from the mirror, and that's when I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps, this time unmistakably coming from upstairs. A soft, steady tread, like someone pacing. My breath caught, and I felt that cold knot in my stomach tighten. I turned and rushed back to our bedroom, closing the door behind me with a slam. My hands were shaking as I locked it. I turned to Emma, who was still fast asleep, unaware of what was happening. God, I didn't want to wake her. Not like this. But I couldn't ignore it. I had to say something. Emma, I whispered, shaking her gently. Emma, wake up. Her eyelids fluttered open, and for a moment she just looked at me, confused. Then the sleepiness faded from her face, replaced by something darker, something uneasy. What's wrong? She asked, her voice hoarse. There's something in the house, I said, my words barely coming out. I could feel the weight of what I was saying, and it sounded so ridiculous even to me. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. What do you mean? Like, what kind of something? I don't know. It's not like ghosts or anything. I think someone's here. I heard footsteps upstairs. She looked at me for a long time, her eyes searching mine, trying to figure out if I was serious. I could tell she was scared, but she wasn't going to let me see it. She was tough, but even tough people have limits. Let's go check it out, she said, standing up and reaching for her robe. I didn't want to, but I wasn't going to argue. I followed her out of the room, my body tense, every sound amplified in the silence. We stood at the foot of the stairs, listening. The house was eerily quiet now. The footsteps had stopped. but there was something about that silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was thick, oppressive, like something was watching us, waiting. Emma took the first step up, but I stopped her. "Wait," I whispered. "Listen." She froze, her head tilting slightly. For a second, all I could hear was the soft hum of the house, but then, there it was again, the scratching. It was faint, like a faint tapping, but it wasn't coming from the walls this time. It was coming from the attic. The attic. I hadn't even thought about it until now, but the thought made my stomach churn. I'd seen the pull-down ladder earlier when we were moving in, but I hadn't really paid it any attention. The attic door had been closed, locked even, as far as I knew. I took a deep breath, my hands clammy as I reached for the ladder. Emma looked at me with wide eyes, her mouth opening to say something, but before she could, the scratching turned into a series of frantic taps, like something trying to get out, and that's when I felt it. The air. It shifted, grew colder, denser. I pulled the ladder down with a slow, deliberate motion, and as the wooden steps creaked into place, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The attic door, had it always been sealed? I was sure it had been, but now it looked different. The wood around the edges was warped, like it had been scratched at. No, scraped. Emma's face was pale now, her lips trembling. "We don't have to do this," she said, but her voice had lost its usual strength. She wasn't trying to be brave anymore. "We have to," I whispered, and I hated how weak I sounded. I climbed the ladder first, feeling the weight of each step as I went higher. The air grew colder with each rung, the silence oppressive. When I finally reached the top, I was hit by a strange scent, damp, musty, like mold. And something else, something rotten. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach turn. I slowly pushed open the attic door. The hinges groaned in protest, but when it opened, I froze. The attic was small, smaller than I expected. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the dim light from the hallway behind me. Boxes were stacked in the corners, old furniture draped in sheets, and in the far corner, a large dark shadow. Something was sitting there. At first I thought it was just an old chair or a stack of boxes, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. There, in the corner, was a figure, a person. Someone was sitting in the attic. Who's there?" My voice cracked. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. The figure didn't move. It just sat there, unmoving. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of their body, draped in shadow. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the floor. Suddenly, a low whisper came from the figure. It was barely audible at first, like a breath, but then it grew louder, more distinct. "Leave, leave, leave." I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dread, and I felt this cold, sinking feeling in my gut, like the house itself was alive, and it hated us. It wanted us gone. Emma was still on the ladder, her face white with fear, but she was paralyzed just like me. We both stood there, staring at the figure, unable to move or even speak. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. 1 second it was there, and the next, nothing, just empty space. I bolted down the ladder, dragging Emma with me, not caring if I fell or broke something. We didn't stop until we were back downstairs, panting and wide-eyed, staring at each other in horror. We never went back into that attic, not once, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the next morning, when we found that the word "leave" had appeared again. This time, it wasn't in the bathroom. It was on the front door, written in deep, dark scratches, like claws had scraped at the wood. We packed up and left that day. No looking back. We packed up and left that day. No looking back. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. There's something about that house, something dark, that still lingers. We found a new place, a small apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. It felt like a fresh start, like we could finally leave all that behind us. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the world is quiet and the house is still, I hear it, the scratching. It's faint at first, like it was before. A soft, insistent tap, tap, tap. Sometimes I think it's just the pipes, the house settling, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the window. But then I remember, there are no trees near our apartment. It always starts around 3 a.m., and sometimes when I'm lying in bed wide awake, I hear a whisper. Just one word. Leave. Emma doesn't hear it anymore. She says I'm just imagining things. Maybe I am, but sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still feel it. That weight, that sense of something watching. And then, one night, after the scratching started again, I decided to check the attic. You'd think I'd learned my lesson, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. When I opened the door, the same dark shadow was there, the same figure, sitting in the corner. But this time, it wasn't still. It was rocking back and forth, slow and deliberate, like it was waiting for me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I could only stare, frozen in place. And then, in the dim light, I saw it. The figure wasn't alone. There, crouched beside it, was another one, smaller. A child, the child's eyes empty, hollow. And in that instant, I knew. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a place of terror. It was a trap, a prison. And it had followed us. But what's worse is that I'm not sure if we were ever meant to leave. Because now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I see them. Those empty eyes staring at me from the shadows. And when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear the tapping, closer this time,